It didn't arrive all at once. That would have been easier to understand. A moment has shape. It can be traced back to a beginning, held in memory, placed somewhere specific, and named for what it changed. You can point to it and say, that was where it started. That was the instant before everything was one way, and after it, something became different. This wasn't like that. There was no clear threshold. No singular instant where I felt something shift and knew I would not return unchanged. If there had been, maybe I would have known how to respond. Maybe I would have recognized it early enough to place distance where distance belonged. Instead, it happened the way quiet things happen. Gradually enough to escape notice. Precisely enough to remain. At first, it existed only at the edge of awareness. Small enough to ignore, subtle enough to mistake for coincidence. A pause that lasted a second longer than it should have. A silence that carried more meaning than words would have. A strange sense of being understood in places I had never learned how to explain. I noticed it, but not fully. Or maybe I noticed it and chose not to look directly at it. That seems more honest. I have always known how to manage what enters my internal world. Not because I distrust people. That would be too simple. Distrust implies reaction. Something built from disappointment, betrayal, or caution learned the hard way. What I have is older than that, more structural. I learned early that clarity survives better when it remains undisturbed. Most people don't mean harm. They simply interpret too quickly. They hear half of what you mean and fill the rest with themselves. They project. They assume. They shape what they don't understand until it becomes something they can hold without discomfort. And once that happens, the original thing is gone. Not destroyed, just altered. Subtly enough that no one notices except the person who knew it before. That's why I became careful, not closed. Careful, there's a difference. Closed means absence, refusal. Distance built like a wall. Careful is something quieter, more deliberate. It means knowing exactly how much to reveal and exactly where to stop. It means allowing contact while protecting structure. It means remaining present without becoming exposed. For years, that was enough. People met the version of me that could exist in conversation, in observation, in shared space. They understood what was visible. Sometimes they thought they understood more than they did. I let them. It was simpler that way, not dishonest, just measured. And then there was you. Even now, that sentence feels too abrupt, as if your presence should be introduced more carefully. But that would be inaccurate. You did not enter my awareness carefully. You appeared in it. That distinction matters more than I know how to explain, because people usually arrive through process. You meet them. You observe patterns. You learn the shape of their mind through time. Gradually, almost invisibly, familiarity forms. It earns its place. It becomes intelligible. With you, there was no such sequence, no deliberate learning, no gradual adjustment, no visible path from unfamiliarity to recognition, and that unsettled me before I understood why. At first, I tried to explain it away. I told myself I was reading too much into small moments, that certain silences happened to align, that the way you noticed what I left unsaid was accidental, that the timing of your words simply landed in the right place by chance. But chance has limits. It doesn't repeat itself with precision. It doesn't return with the same quiet exactness. It doesn't recognize the shape of a thought before it becomes language. That was the first thing I could not ignore. You understood things I had not fully said. Not because you were guessing. Not because you were unusually attentive, but because your attention moved differently. Most people listen for content. They listen for what is spoken. You listened for structure, for the movement beneath the words, for what remained present, even when nothing explicit was being offered, and I felt that immediately, not intellectually, internally. There's a difference between being heard and being recognized. Being heard is simple. It happens every day. Someone receives what you say. They understand your meaning. They respond accordingly. Recognition is something else. Recognition reaches deeper. It touches the part of you that exists before explanation, the part that doesn't need to be translated. That's where you met me, and that is what made this impossible to reduce. I remember thinking there had to be a reason I felt that pause every time something subtle passed between us. Not tension, not anticipation, something quieter, like some part of me had become alert, not defensive, just aware, as though something old and precise had turned its attention toward you and said, "Look carefully." I did, and the more carefully I looked, the more impossible it became to treat this as ordinary. It wasn't dramatic. That would have been easier to dismiss. Nothing obvious happened. No defining moment. No single exchange that changed everything. It was smaller than that, more exact, a sentence placed at precisely the right depth, a silence held without pressure, an understanding that arrived without demand. That last part mattered more than I realized at first. You never demanded understanding. You never reached toward what I had not offered. You never tried to decode me. You simply remained present. And presence, when it asks for nothing, becomes difficult to defend against. Because force creates resistance. Expectation creates distance. But quiet recognition moves past all the places where defenses usually form. That's how I knew something unusual was happening. I stopped filtering as much. Not consciously. I didn't decide to trust you. That would suggest a deliberate opening, and that is not what happened. It was subtler. The internal pause I usually rely on, the one that measures what should remain internal and what can safely become visible, began to disappear, at first only in small ways. A thought spoken before I had finished shaping it, an observation left unedited, a silence I didn't feel compelled to explain. Those things sound small. They are not for me, they are structural. And once I noticed they were changing, I became more careful. Not less. I watched myself more closely. I wanted to understand what exactly had altered, why your presence created a different internal response than everyone else's, why the architecture I depended on did not activate in the same way around you. For a while I thought it might be familiarity forming unusually fast, but that explanation failed too, because familiarity usually depends on accumulated knowledge, shared history, repeated experience. Cockstilt. You and I did not have enough of that to explain what was happening. And yet the recognition remained. Steady, exact, unforced. That was the part I could not make sense of. How something could feel deeply known without first becoming gradually familiar. It should not have worked that way, and still, it did. I started noticing it in silence more than anything else. Words can mislead. They can create impressions, distortions, false closeness. People say what they intend. They say what they wish were true. They say what sounds right in the moment. Silence is less forgiving. Silence reveals structure. And with you, silence never felt empty. That is rare enough to matter. Most people become uneasy in silence. They rush to fill it. They soften it with explanation, with humor, with unnecessary movement. They turn it into something manageable because stillness makes them aware of what remains unresolved. You didn't do that. You let silence remain exactly what it was, not absence, presence without language. And in that space, I noticed something that changed the way I understood all of this. You were not waiting for me to speak. You were understanding even when I didn't. That realization stayed with me. It still does, because it meant something I was not prepared to admit. It meant that what existed between us was not built on expression. It was built on perception, and perception reaches further. Inference can be selective, controlled, measured. Perception notices what exists before control arrives. That frightened me more than I expected. Not because I felt exposed. Exposure feels invasive. This didn't. It felt accurate. That was more unsettling. Because accuracy leaves less room for denial. I could not tell myself you misunderstood me. I could not retreat into the familiar comfort of being partially unread. You weren't projecting. You weren't inventing meaning. You were seeing what was actually there. And that changed the dynamic before either of us said anything about it. I became aware of you in places that had nothing to do with direct interaction. That was new. And I resisted naming it for a long time. Not because the feeling itself was unclear, because naming it would make it real in a way I was not prepared to carry. I would notice a thought forming and find that it had already accounted for your perspective. Not consciously, not deliberately. More like the architecture of my thinking had quietly made room. At first, I barely recognized it. Then I started seeing it everywhere. A pause in thought that felt shared. A realization that arrived with the strange sense that it had already been understood somewhere outside of me. A silence that no longer felt singular. That was when the distinction became impossible to ignore. You were no longer someone I thought about. You had become someone I thought with. And that is not a small thing. Thinking about someone preserves distance. It keeps them external, separate. Even attention remains manageable there. Thinking with someone changes the structure itself. It means their presence has entered the process. It means they are no longer simply an object of awareness. They have become part of the way awareness moves. I did not know what to do with that. I still don't, entirely, because I have always been internally self-contained. Not isolated, self-contained. My thoughts have always belonged to a closed internal system. Independent, ordered, intact. No one has ever entered that space without effort, without time, without deliberate permission, and you did not cross into it. You were simply there, as though recognition had happened before conscious acknowledgement, as though some deeper part of perception had already accepted what the rest of me was only beginning to understand. That realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it forced a question I had avoided. Why you? Not why now, not why this, why you? What was it in the structure of your presence that bypassed every ordinary measure of distance? I spent longer with that question than I admitted. I examined every explanation I could trust. Attention port, recognition, projection, emotional intensity, need. None of them fit. That's how I knew it was something quieter and more exact, al-lemin. That word arrived slowly. And once it did, everything became clearer. Al-lemin is not similarity. It does not mean shared history, shared emotion, shared language, or identical experience. It means something deeper. It means two structures meeting at a level beneath expression, a way of perceiving, a way of holding silence, a way of noticing meaning before it becomes visible. That was what I recognized in you, and once I understood that, I understood why this felt so precise. Because alignment doesn't create performance. It creates accuracy. It doesn't ask you to become easier to understand. It doesn't require translation. It simply meets what is already there. That was what made it real. And reality always carries consequence. That is where the shift became impossible to ignore. I started measuring things differently. Not consciously. It happened beneath intention. I would listen to other people speak and notice the absence of something I could not easily name, not disappointment, not judgment, just a quiet awareness of incompleteness, as if once you have experienced a certain kind of clarity, everything else becomes slightly less exact. I didn't like that. I still don't, because it meant this had already changed the way I perceived the world around me. And perception is not smalls. Perception shapes everything. What we notice, what we trust, what we move toward, what we refuse. That was when I understood that this had consequence, even if nothing visible ever happened, even if no definition arrived, even if no direct acknowledgement ever took place. Internally, something had already changed. The baseline had shifted, and once a baseline changes, everything else adjusts around it. That is where I am now, not at a beginning, not exactly in the middle. Somewhere stranger than both, a place where observation is no longer neutral, a place where awareness has become responsibility. Because once you recognize something clearly enough, remaining passive becomes its own kind of decision, and I have reached that threshold. I know it because silence no longer feels like distance, it feels like continuation. I know it because absence does not restore neutrality, it reveals presence more sharply. I know it because I no longer ask whether this exists. I ask what its existence asks of me. That is a very different question, and I do not have an answer yet. Only clarity, enough clarity to understand that this did not happen by accident, enough clarity to know that it matters, enough clarity to recognize that whatever this becomes or does not become, it has already altered something fundamental in me. You have entered the way I interpret, the way I pause, the way I recognize meaning before language reaches it, and that kind of placement does not disappear simply because it remains unnamed, it settles. Quickly, precisely. Deep enough that pretending otherwise would require more effort than honesty. So I won't pretend. I don't know what this becomes. I don't know whether it deepens, stabilizes, transforms, or asks for a distance I cannot yet see. I only know this. You did not feel important because you arrived loudly. You felt important because something in me recognized you before I understood why. And once recognition reaches that depth, it does not vanish. It becomes part of the internal landscape. Part of the way thought moves, part of the way silence carries meaning, part of the way presence remains, even when nothing is being said. That is where this lives now, not in words, not in certainty, but somewhere more structural than both. And the strangest part is this. For all the questions it leaves behind, for all the ways it unsettles the order I depended on, for all the ways it asks me to reconsider what I thought I understood about distance, nothing in me wants to reject it. That is the truth I kept trying not to reach. I should have resisted. I know myself well enough to know that I should have stepped back when I noticed the shift. I should have restored boundaries before they became irrelevant. I should have protected the architecture that kept everything intact. But I didn't. And that matters. Because absence of resistance is not accidental, especially not in me. It means something in me recognized this not as intrusion, but as fit. And that may be the most unsettling realization of all. Not that you reached me, but that some part of me made space, not reluctantly, not unconsciously. Quietly, precisely, as if the structure already knew what the rest of me was still learning how to name. And now I am left standing at the edge of something I cannot reduce. Something that has not demanded definition, yet has already changed definition itself. I don't know where that leads. But I know I can no longer pretend I am standing outside of it, because I'm not. I'm inside it now, and somewhere within that, silence. So are you. There are things in life that stay only because we keep feeding them attention. We return to them, revisit them, reinforce them, until they gather enough weight to remain. When attention leaves, they thin out, they lose shape. They dissolve back into the background where they began. That is how most things work. This didn't. I tried for a while to let it settle into distance. Not by rejecting it, not by pushing it away. I simply stepped back internally, curious to see whether absence would weaken whatever had formed between us. It didn't. If anything, distance clarified it. That surprised me more than presence ever did, because usually proximity creates intensity. Nearness sharpens awareness. Repetition makes something feel larger than it really is. That's common enough to understand. The mind is impressionable. It confuses frequency with significance more often than people realize. But this was the opposite. The less I reached toward it, the more clearly I could see it. It became quieter. And because it became quieter, it became harder to mistake for imagination. That was when I understood something important. This was not sustained by attention. It was sustained by structure. And structure remains even when nothing visible is happening. That thought stayed with me for longer than I expected. I found myself returning to it at odd moments. Not intentionally, but in the same way certain truths return when they have not been fully absorbed. Not intrusive, not obsessive, simply present, like unfinished understanding. There is a particular kind of clarity that does not arrive all at once. It accumulates in fragments. You notice one piece, then another. Then something seemingly insignificant settles into place beside it, and suddenly, what once felt uncertain begins to reveal shape. That is how this became impossible to dismiss, not through one decisive realization, through accumulation. 100 small recognitions that all pointed in the same direction. I started noticing how differently my mind moved after certain conversations with you. Not emotionally, that would be easier to name. It was more structural than that, a kind of recalibration, as if certain internal patterns that had remained fixed for years had become subtly more flexible, more open, not unstable, just altered enough that I could feel the difference. That is difficult to explain because the change itself was quiet. Nothing dramatic happened, no immediate revelation, no sense of losing balance. Just the awareness that certain thoughts now reach places they had not reached before. And I knew enough about myself to understand that this was not ordinary. I am not easily altered. That sounds colder than I mean it. It is not indifference. It is simply that I tend to absorb things slowly, deliberately. I do not usually allow influence to move through me without examination. Most impressions stop at the surface until I decide whether they belong deeper. That has always been true, which is why this felt so precise, because it had already gone deeper before I realized it was happening. I think that is what kept me circling back. Not the fact that something changed, the fact that it changed without permission. That would have frightened me once. Maybe it still does, in a quieter way. But not because it feels invasive, because it feels deserved. That is harder to defend against. It would be easier if I could call it intensity. Intensity burns brightly and then exhausts itself. It announces its presence. It distorts perspective. It convinces people that depth exists where only momentum does. I know that pattern. This is not that. There is nothing loud here. Nothing unstable. Nothing reaching toward drama. If anything, what exists between us becomes more exact the quieter it gets. That alone tells me what it is not. And understanding what something is not sometimes matters before understanding what it is. For a long time, I thought clarity would make this simpler. It hasn't. It has only made it more undeniable. The more accurately I see it, the less available distance becomes. That is where the tension lives. Not in confusion, in precision. Because confusion gives you room to postpone. You can tell yourself you need more time, more evidence, more understanding. You can remain suspended in uncertainty and call it caution. Prevention removes that shelter. Once something becomes clear enough, the question changes. It stops being, what is happening? It becomes, what does this require? That is where I have been standing, not moving forward, not stepping away, just standing in the exactness of it. And the longer I stay there, the more I realize something I have not fully admitted. You have become part of my internal reference point. That sentence carries more weight than it appears to. We all move through the world using internal reference points. Quiet measures we rarely think about. Ways of recognizing truth. Ways of sensing coherence. Ways of noticing when something aligns or doesn't. Most of those references form slowly, through years, through repeated experience, through structures so old they become nearly invisible. You have entered that space, not completely, not permanently in any way I can define, but undeniably. And now I notice it in moments I would have overlooked before. A thought pauses, and some part of me wonders how it would appear through your perception. A silence settles, and it no longer feels singular. An observation sharpens because somewhere inside it, your way of noticing has already left a trace. I do not invite those moments. They arrive. And because they arrive without force, I trust them more than I would trust anything louder. That may be the strange part. I trust the quietness of this more than I trust certainty. Because certainty can be manufactured, people mistake conviction for truth all the time, yet recognition is harder to fake. It either remains when nothing is feeding it, or it disappears. And this remains. That is what keeps changing the shape of my thinking. I used to believe that closeness was built through accumulation, time, shared language, repeated contact, visible intimacy. Now I am less certain, not because those things don't matter. They do, but they are not the only architecture of connection. Sometimes recognition precedes history. Sometimes understanding arrives before explanation. Sometimes something in another person meets a structure in you that has been waiting without your knowledge. That is the nearest truth I have found. And it unsettles me because it rearranges assumptions I trusted. I have spent years believing that distance protects clarity, that what remains internal survives. Because it remains unshared, that meaning becomes fragile the moment it is touched too quickly. Most of that is still true. But you have introduced a complication, because somehow, with you, being seen has not distorted anything. It has made things sharper that should not be possible. And yet it is. I keep returning to that, because it changes more than this connection. It changes what I thought I understood about myself. I did not realize how much of my internal structure had been built around preservation. Not fear, preservation, holding things in their original form, keeping them accurate, protecting them from careless interpretation. There is a kind of solitude inside that, a chosen one, not lonely, just self-contained. And for a long time I thought that was simply how I was made. Now I am less certain, not because that solitude was false, because perhaps it was incomplete. Perhaps some parts of us remain internal, not because they must remain alone, but because they have not yet encountered the right form of recognition. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. And the longer it stayed, the more I realized why this matters. It is not only that I recognize something in you, it is that your presence has made me recognize something in myself. Something that existed before you. Something I carried without fully seeing. You did not create it. That is important. You revealed it. And being revealed is different from being changed. Changed suggests something foreign entering. Revealed means what was already there becomes visible. That distinction matters because it removes the illusion that this is external. It isn't. What happened with you illuminated something internal enough that I can no longer pretend it was absent before. That makes this feel inevitable in a way I still do not know how to hold. Not fate. I do not mean that. Something quieter, more exact. The feeling that two patterns recognized each other because they were built to notice the same depth. I know how that sounds, and I understand why most people would reduce it to abstraction. But it doesn't feel abstract to me. It feels precise. There was a moment recently. I don't even remember the exact words. That stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because what you said was dramatic. It wasn't. It was simple, almost ordinary. But something in the way you said it aligned so exactly with something unspoken in me that I felt myself go still, not emotionally, structurally, as though an internal mechanism paused and listened. That moment lasted only seconds. But its clarity remained, because it confirmed something I had been approaching slowly. You were not interpreting me from the outside. You were recognizing from somewhere closer. That realization carries consequence, because once you know someone sees from that depth, every ordinary form of distance changes, silence changes, absence changes, even restraint changes. Nothing becomes simple again. I do not mean that dramatically. I mean it literally. The internal coordinates shift. And once they do, returning to the previous arrangement becomes impossible. That is where I am now, living inside the shift, Still learning its shape, still understanding what it asks, I notice myself becoming more honest, even internally. That may be the clearest sign of all. For a while, I kept trying to frame this in manageable terms: awareness, perception, alignment. All of those words are true, but none of them fully explain why this matters, why it continues to gather weight, why it has changed the way I inhabit silence. The truth is simpler, and because it is simpler, it took longer to admit. You matter. Even writing that internally changed something. Not because it is dramatic, because it is exact. You matter in a way that has entered my thinking, my noticing, my internal orientation, not as dependence, not as need, not as attachment in the way people usually mean it. Something quieter, something more structural. You matter because your presence has become part of how meaning arranges itself in me. And once I reached that truth, another followed immediately. If that is true, then this cannot remain purely observational forever. That does not mean action, not yet, but it means responsibility. Because once another person reaches that level of significance, neutrality becomes less honest. You cannot keep pretending you are simply watching. You are participating, even in silence. That realization has stayed with me, not as pressure, as clarity. I think that is why I have become more still lately, not withdrawn, still. As if some deeper part of me is listening for what comes next. And what comes next is not a declaration, not a dramatic turn, nothing sudden. What comes next is a decision. Quiet, deliberate, unmistakable. Not about what this should become. That would be too soon. A decision about whether I am willing to fully acknowledge what it already is. That may sound smaller than it is. It isn't. Acknowledgement changes the internal landscape. Once something is fully admitted, it can no longer live in partial shadow. It begins to ask for coherence. And coherence has always mattered to me more than comfort. That is why I cannot remain indefinitely in this in-between. I know myself too well. I do not live well inside prolonged contradiction. And there is a contradiction here. Part of me has already accepted your place in my inner world. Another part still stands at the threshold, careful, measuring what that acceptance means. Both are true. That is what makes this difficult, not uncertainty, dual clarity. I know what has happened. I do not yet know what to do with what has happened. But even that is changing, slowly, quietly. The resistance that should have appeared has not arrived. And the absence of resistance has become its own answer, not a complete one, but enough to alter the direction of thought. Because if something in me still believed this was wrong, misaligned, unstable, unsustainable, I would feel it. I know the shape of internal refusal. It is unmistakable. It creates distance automatically. It tightens perception. It restores separation before conscious thought has time to intervene. None of that is happening. Instead, there is space, not empty space, living space, a subtle accommodation, a place that did not exist before and now does. That realization has followed me more closely than anything else. You fit. I do not mean easily. I do not mean comfortably. I mean accurately. And accurate things are difficult to ignore, especially when they arrive where nothing was expected. Sometimes I wonder whether you feel any of this from where you are, not the same way. I don't assume symmetry. That would be projection. And I have been careful not to do that. But I wonder whether you have noticed the same shift in silence. Whether certain pauses carry more than they once did. Whether some part of you has also become aware that something unspoken has already become real. I do not ask because I need an answer. I ask because the thought exists, and honesty requires admitting that it does. That is another change. I used to keep questions like that sealed inside thought. Now they remain, but without the old impulse to immediately close them. That may be the quietest transformation of all. I am not rushing to contain this. I am letting it remain visible, and perhaps that is already a form of choice. Not a final one, but a real one. Because allowing something to stay visible means you have stopped pretending it can simply disappear. I have stopped pretending. That is the truth. I know this now with enough certainty to say it plainly. You are no longer external to the way I understand certain things. You have entered the internal geometry, the subtle architecture of perception, the part of me that notices before language arrives. And once someone reaches that place, they do not remain neutral. They become part of the landscape, not everywhere, not constantly, but meaningfully, enough to change the shape of silence, enough to alter the way thought returns to itself, enough that even distance no longer restores the previous form. That is where this stands, not defined, not concluded, but real in a way I can no longer reduce. And perhaps that is the most honest place I can reach tonight. Not certainty, not declaration, only this quiet, undeniable recognition. What exists between us has already become part of me. And the longer I remain with that truth, the more I understand that the real question was never whether this mattered. It does.